Fantastic. Well, off we go. This is the July edition of the Sooner, Safer, Happier Meetup event. We've been doing this all year, kicked it off at the beginning of the year, and it's been so much fun meeting so many people really all over the country doing this in a virtual setting, which has been fantastic. So we've really enjoyed being a part of this. I know Peter, myself, and Courtney, who'll be speaking tonight, and others who have come together to really nurture this community. And of course, you all as participants make all this happen. So thanks for joining in. And hey, tonight we're introducing Courtney, who'll be speaking tonight as a senior technology leader. So for those who haven't met Courtney or had the opportunity to see her speak, very well known in the DevOps space, great speaker at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, where I had the opportunity to see you speak there, both on your topic and with the panel that you did last year in October in the Vegas virtual event, which I just thought was phenomenal. So we're just really excited, Courtney, for the opportunity to learn from you, both in your experience working in the large enterprise space as a technology senior leader at Nike, Nordstrom. So she's going to take some time and kind of share her experiences there, as well in the smaller organizational setting, and what you've taken on here as the beginning of this year. So Courtney, by way of intro, we'll hand it off to you, and everyone welcome. So this will be very interactive, conversational, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the intro and super excited to be here. And I do really want it to be interactive. So please, ask questions along the way. I will try really hard to pause as well along the way. But the intent was really to share some of the, I'll just call it journey and learnings that I've had from being part of large enterprises. So Nordstrom, Starbucks, Nike. Now I'm working at Zulily, which is smaller organization. And I'll share a little bit about what I'm learning there as well. So the lead in before I go into more of the detail, and probably not surprising to this group, every organization is different. And one of the things that I've learned is that you can't take your playbook and just apply it in the new organization that you're in. There are common patterns and anti-patterns, but it's so important to start with, and I put this here, the first 90 days framework is something that I believe passionately in. Taking the time to really listen, learn, understand the reality that's happening in the organization that you're in, being intentional about where you need to focus as a leader, and really having that be informed by what you gather from the first 90 days. The framework, but listening a lot. And this next one also won't be surprising to this group. And, the focus on creating a dynamic learning organization and a generative culture. So right out of the Western model, near and dear to all of our hearts, super critical, often challenging depending on the environment that you're in. And then this last one, as a leader, I think it's super important to constantly be learning and evolving. I truly believe that the broader, I'll just say, leadership community, especially senior leaders, I had need to here. I really think it's more of a must. Leaders must evolve in order to really create the right environment for teams and to really create that generative culture. So it's a little bit of the lead in. So this is a lot of words, but bear with me. I'm, collection of some of the things that I've learned along the way. This first one, and the reason why I have this at the top is, working in enterprises, I think often the go-to move is to buy versus build. And we've all heard this throughout our careers. I think that there's still this underlying important principle around building for competitive advantage. And I think it belongs as a consideration across the entire value chain. So I think a lot of times companies are going through digital transformation and they say, well, of course we're going to build in our digital landscape. because that's the strategic component of our offering. Well, there's other parts of the value chain that are just as strategic that often don't get considered as build options. Now, I didn't put this in here because sometimes, depending on the audience, this concept might not be practiced or known, but leveraging something like Wardley mapping to really outline like where should we be utility and where should we be strategic. And supply chain is an area that I'm pretty passionate about, is a candidate for build when you're using your supply chain for strategic intent. And it's one of the reasons I joined Zulily, is because our supply chain technology is all build. There's no buy as part of our supply chain ecosystem. My other learning is that you don't do agile, which I put in quotes, because I think there's a lot of companies that just say they Google scaled agile, they likely stumble across SAFe, and then they kind of take SAFe and they just like unveil it and distribute it out to the masses and expect that to get better outcomes. And I often think that what's missing in that is really knowing what is important and focusing on outcomes, and then creating the right methodology and or ways of working that are optimized for those outcomes. So I don't think it's a one size fits all. I don't think top-down mandates are the best way to get sustained results. I think you can get short-term results, and I think you need top level support anytime you're going through something that is a transformation, because grassroots will get you so far. And I see some familiar faces on this call who know kind of some of that dialogue that we've had around grassroots. Will get some amount of momentum, top down will get some amount of momentum, but where the most success I've seen is when you really have both. You've got senior leaders engaged, you've got your teams engaged, you've got leadership all up and down and across the organization engaged, is where the momentum gets sustained. And then I pulled out some of the Agile Manifesto because I truly believe it's a great reminder. As for myself, I mean, personally, when I was first immersed in SAFe as an option for a framework, one of the things that I did wrong as a leader is I didn't really recognize that we were going against some of the Agile Manifesto when we made decisions about the rollout of SAFe. It was like all about process, all about tooling, all about like everybody's got to follow this exact plan and these exact parameters. And it was like, oh my gosh, we missed the boat here. We really should have focused on team and how might this make sense depending on the outcome the team's trying to achieve. The other learning, and I know that there's a lot, in fact, I've been seeing more of this too, like out in social media around the criticality of your architecture and how that can create certain dynamics in an organization. I mean, we all know Conway's Law, but I think it's even deeper than that. And I think often organizations don't apply, I'm calling it the isolation kind of containment pattern, but like really putting monolithic architecture into more of a containment state so you can really focus on what is needed to scale and grow. And I think that shows up more in enterprises, but I will tell you that so I've been at Zulily now 6 months. Zulily's been around 11 years. There is absolutely a need for us to apply an isolation pattern to certain components of our technology stack, because it's just the nature of the evolution of technology. Anything that was built 10 years ago is probably by now a monolith, just because of the nature of how things evolve. My other passion is around work is work. I'm not a fan of the, and this is, we all kind of know this from a DevOps perspective, but there are organizations that still practice this, where they have a team that's doing feature work, a team that's doing production support work, a team that's doing tech debt reduction, and it's all siloed, versus a team that's accountable for all of that work, because it's a contributing factor to the health of the work that they're delivering to their customer. So not having that separate. I tend to talk a lot about speed. Sometimes that's misunderstood, because sometimes individuals will see that as my attempt to cut corners. So what I have to make sure that I message is, speed does not mean that you compromise on quality. In fact, if you're compromising on quality, you're not doing speed right. And we all know from Accelerate and State of DevOps reports and all the data that you don't have to make a trade-off between speed and quality. But really making sure that lead time and cycle time is understood and something that's visible and used to inform, like, how are we really doing with speed to value? I also, because I experienced this directly, if you lead with cost as your optimization that you're going after, you won't get speed. If you lead with speed, you can still achieve cost and efficiency. And I believe that in my core. I've seen it play out. Anytime a organization is talking about how do we save money, it often will not equate to getting the speed outcomes and the speed to value outcomes. And then infrastructure as code. So I came from infrastructure. That was my my first role in technology, and for most of the first half of my career was infrastructure, and making that transition to really treating infrastructure as code and creating the self-service capability so that, it's not about submitting tickets. It's not about having these really long lead times. It's how do we create an optimized experience for the consumers of infrastructure? And then really shifting away from the traditional kind of admin administrative roles in infrastructure to being more of an engineer. And how do you have that kind of engineering mindset as part of how you're delivering infrastructure to the organization? So I'm going to pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions before I move on any of the stuff that I've covered so far.
Hey, Courtney, this is Anna Brasoni. I work for John Deere Financials. I've gone through your course in Coursera, so I can relate to these topics that you're sharing. The topic you're talking about, apply isolation containment pattern. Are you a proponent of people take your monolith first, containerize it, put it in the cloud, and then do the transformation, break it into microservices and micro front ends, or are you saying, do the transformation and together?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that worries me sometimes about almost like lift and shift, right? Like take that monolithic architecture and get it to the cloud, is the commitment from the organization to really deprecate it. Because I think sometimes once you get it to the cloud, it's like there are certain opinions that may think, oh, we've modernized it. Like, well, it's running in the cloud. But in reality, it's just not running in a data center. And so if you can get the support in the organization to really deprecate it, then I think it's okay. But if the organization isn't going to still invest in really making it go away, then I would not advocate for that. And sometimes you can't know, but you might be able to pressure test a little bit around just how well has your organization done with, I use deprecation, sometimes the organization call it like sunset, but like really taking something out of the organization and stopping it and not investing in it anymore. If you have that system already, where you get the leadership support, you get the financial support, you get the prioritization support, then I think you can go down that path. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I was looking at the chat and, I think it's Katie who said, stumble across SAFE, you speak like it's a tripping hazard. I could probably do an entire conversation about SAFE. What I think has happened in the industry when it comes to SAFE is too many organizations have just taken it and wanted like the answer. And so they're like, this is our answer. And so we're just going to take this and we're going to certify everyone and we're going to train everybody and we're just going to adopt it, versus really understanding, where are we at on our journey? Do we really ground the how we're getting work done in outcomes and the best method depending on the work? And so, yeah, so I probably come across a little bit, I don't know. I don't want to say anti-SAFE. I'm more, I've learned a lot about the application of it in enterprises and how sometimes it can be done in a way that doesn't really start with the spirit of like, what outcomes are you trying to achieve?
I've never met anyone who has ever shipped code or delivered an experience that can say anything positive about SAFE.
Yeah, I do have some of my like DevOps network who are doing it and feel like they've figured out how to adjust it to make it work in their environment. And I'm constantly like, I'll just say not constantly, but I frequently try to gain some inspiration from that, because I am more of an advocate for understand your value stream map and do whatever you can to get to optimizing the flow of that value. Like that is where I tend to want to start and say, if you can do that, and then SAFE becomes the way that you optimize that flow of value, then awesome. But starting with everyone will, it's similar to, and this is, I'm facing this actually in my current role, similar to the Spotify model. Everyone wants to just take the Spotify model and like rename all their teams and just like snap to it, like almost like a copy paste. And even Spotify tells you don't do that. But a lot of organizations have done that. They've just taken that model and said, we're now going to practice that in our organization. And I think it loses the spirit of, you can't just take a tactic that worked in one context and then copy it. Peter said it right here. Learn from it, but don't copy it. Yeah.
I have to say, though, that in Spotify's defense and in SAFE's defense, what they are presenting are scaled models. So a guild is a scale of teams, and it's a scale of the social aspect of information. When you can't get meaning with a single team, when you can't get agile, you can't get flow, all you end up doing is obfuscating both the work to be done and who actually does it. So if you do things right, you can scale meaning and you can scale communication, which is where the Spotify model does work and where SAFE does work. But
yeah,
SAFE's idea of creating visibility by creating like a cadence where, everything, just scales, it's a model that only works if you can get meaning at the smallest individual unit. And so
Yeah.
we're so busy about orchestrating, we can't ever get it right the first time.
Yeah, I don't know that I buy into that. I'm sorry, because the idea of guilds and such have been around way before there was a thing called Spotify, or way before there was a thing called SAFE, or much less RUP, from which it derives. Because back in the 80s at IBM, we had internal chapters for specific, knowledge or centers of interest, or centers of engineering, not to be confused with centers of excellence, because God knows what that means. But I think that they've somehow been conflated in both contexts. And but I do agree that if the organizational context does not permit that professional exploration at the micro, and by micro I mean the individual and the team level, God help you trying to macro it.
Yep. Yep. And I think it just lends itself to that, start small and scale. It's like versus assuming you can just apply this at scale and then learn, oh, it's not really working for us. So totally agree. I also believe, and, agile is a mindset. Not all work belongs in that methodology, though. There is work, especially in enterprises, that will and probably should follow a waterfall model. It doesn't mean you can't apply an agile mindset, but there is work that's done that is a great candidate for waterfall. And I'll give examples. Opening a fulfillment center, opening a store. There are certain activities that a lot of enterprises encounter that it's okay to not have every single candidate of work practicing the exact same methodology. And it should be about the work. And I think that happens too, where like the pendulum gets swung, and then it's like, well, you got to go in and do quarterly planning for, I'm opening a fulfillment center. I don't like, it's kind of, there's not a lot of variation here. It's a known. So having the agile ceremonies forced, or the construct forced on work that doesn't really belong, I think also gets people frustrated with the application of it. And then things get a bad name because it's like, well, I got forced to use this construct when the work really wasn't a good candidate for it. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, so here are a few of the thoughts that I've collected around kind of leadership's role in a lot of the kind of transformations that I've been involved in. So the first one, having alignment with the business is a huge accelerator. So what I've seen and personally experienced is sometimes some of these transformations around ways of working become a technology problem. It's like, well, tech just needs to be more agile. Well, tech just needs to modernize. Well, tech just needs to have product managers. I mean, it's like all of these things that really are an organizational company transformation. And you need your business stakeholders to be just as invested in that transformation as technology is. And I've seen that be a huge unlock when you have that alignment. I also believe it's super important that leaders understand the capacity in the organization. The capacity is often fixed. And yes, you can ebb and flow, but just bear with me. Like knowing what a team's reality is. So what are they working on, and how does that contribute to commitments that we can make with some amount of confidence? Because what I find is often there's just, well, just give me the estimation for this feature. It's like, well, it needs to be taken in the context of the capacity in the organization. And often There's not a recognition of the amount of operational work that is critical, and that capacity isn't always understood or protected. And so then you end up with unplanned work, which we all know is a vicious cycle. I find this with audit work as well. Most organizations have some amount of audit activity if they're publicly traded. SOX, PCI. It's not a surprise that that's happening every single year. But often it's not accounted for in the capacity of the teams. And so then it becomes a reactionary effort every time audit spins up. It's like, oh, we're starting our PCI audit again. And everybody goes, uh-oh, like I'm gonna have to delay something in order to take that on. Should be intentional and part of the capacity that's in the organization. I think having data, and it needs to be self-served so that teams really can, so we can reduce burden on teams. So the DORA metrics, the Accelerate metrics, I'm extremely passionate about. They have to be used in a way to create psychological safety. You can't just pull the data or ask the teams to track the data. It needs to be used for learning and for the team to know that it's being leveraged to support the reduction of burden in the teams. I think senior leaders need to be accountable for enterprise-wide prioritization. I think that often there is not a, that leaders don't often want to practice the discipline of truly stack ranking the work that is happening in the organization. Because often I've heard things like, well, we have so many people, like why would we ever need to stack rank? And what I've seen work really well is when leaders at the senior level are aligned on those priorities, then the teams aren't having to do conflict resolution when there is always going to be something that might have to be a trade-off. And so giving that strategic prioritization allows for empowerment down at the team level to drive decisions. And that it has to be balanced in how that's quantified. Like it can't always be the top priorities are the things that drive the most revenue. There are also priorities that are risk related, that are contract driven and date driven. And I call it a strategic booster because there could be innovation activities that will never make the list because you don't yet know if they're going to drive revenue or not. But you need some amount of experimentation so that you can learn. And then I already mentioned the capacity component. I think it's important to know capacity in order to really, it's a feedback loop. OKRs. I know there's a lot of industry dialogue around OKRs right now, including John Smart's awesome talk. If you haven't seen it, not okay, OKRs. I also think that this could have a very similar as our Spotify and Safe conversation. Everybody wants to do OKRs and everybody will say they want to do OKRs, but then the practice of it in the organization will be, it just depends on like who's involved and how you go about it. So I'm a believer in you got to have the system and the structure first. Because the first thing I'll get asked when I talk about OKRs is like, what tool are we going to select to manage our OKRs? I'm like, wrong question. We should not be talking about a tool. We should be talking about how are we going to function as an organization? What system are we going to use to really practice OKRs in a meaningful way? Do we have a forum to review our OKRs and make adjustments as needed? Do we have the support in the organization to really truly make those adjustments? Are we disciplined with our OKRs? Like you cannot have 50. You also can't think that an OKR is a KPI. You need KPIs, you need both. But if you have your OKR list is KPIs, then that's an indication that there needs to be an adjustment made. And I think it's also important to share OKRs. So often there's, well, let me say it differently. Most organizations, including ones of the size of Zulily, to deliver a strategic outcome often can't be done autonomously. So teams are dependent on each other in order to deliver a strategic outcome. And if that's not clear and there's not clarity that this OKR is something we're going to focus on as an organization, I need these 4 teams to come together for that to be successful, then we should all be aligned and sharing that OKR and being in the same forum to assess and validate and adjust if needed. And then I think data is meaningless if you don't have context. So looking at a number, you can't draw a conclusion. I mean, you can, but I think it could be considered reckless. It's like you need the context. And most of the data is meaningful at the team level, not an aggregate. And I'll give you an example that I get asked all the time. What is the aggregate or average, even worse, cycle time for your organization? Doesn't matter. That's like not even a question that we should answer. What is it at the team level? What is it across a value stream? High value. At technology, it's not going to tell us anything that we can action. I feel the same way about employee net promoter score. Well, just roll that up to your community, because we use the Spotify terminology. It's like, roll it up. It's like, well, but no, that just lost its meaning. The meaning is at the team level, because if you're not looking at it at that level, you really don't know like what's contributing to the data. And so that's another thing that I've learned throughout my time, is that averages, aggregates, not where I've found the most value. I've found a lot more value with having the team level data. So I'm going to pause again. I'm pulling up chat. Thank you, Katie, for posting that link. And feel free if anyone has any questions as I'm scrolling through here.
Courtney, this is Dan. I was going to chime on this last insight you were sharing for a moment, because this is very top of mind in our organization, where we worked very hard to bring our version of our outcomes dashboard alive. And we're very good at looking at it at the team level, but we're also very good about aggregating it. And we just looked at something today inside our organization that in aggregate, we were struggling to find meaning. And all the questions that were being asked as we were looking at the visual was, well, can we learn more at the team level? What does it look like at this level? We need more context to really understand how to action what we're looking at. And it's, this is at large scale side. This is really resonating strongly for me. And I'm curious, just in your experience here, when it says, when you say at the team level, I think about our large enterprises where, I imagine most, if not many, are structured in matrixed ways, where you have things like scrum teams, or you may have cross-functional units. You may have some cases where it's done via the organizational hierarchy to define that as the team. So like a manager and her or his direct reports. And just love to learn a little bit more about the team context and how you've taken data to apply that to different kinds of teams. And do you prefer one over the other? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I think like what I would love to see, but I haven't seen many organizations get to this point yet, is the team definition is the value stream. That is the team, which is or let me say it differently. It's highly unlikely that matches an org hierarchy. It's probably what you described. It's like it's going to be matrixed, but that's where I found, like, if you know the lead time and the cycle time of a value stream, power, I think it gives you a lot of information. also understanding, the team dynamic, like the ENPS of that value stream team, super important. Now, what I've seen is if you're practicing product model, which some organizations are, that can be a good construct. So we're going to look at the product team metrics, which sometimes doesn't equate to the org structure either, because what I've had is, that engineers might roll to one leader, the product managers might roll to another leader, the scrum master might roll to a different leader, and then you've got, the HR managers across all of those dimensions as well. And maybe depending on how mature the product model is, you might also have still a dependency on like a quality organization or other shared services. So team definition is important. And I think having that be about like, what outcome are we driving towards? And can we get the data at that level? So in the case of the product team, what I would do is we would use the product team construct. And then when we pulled teams together to talk about the data, we would do the kind of any adjacent products that were working together in the broader ecosystem would come together. And I'll give an example from Nike. So when I was supporting the digital platform engineering team, which is, over 800 people, and we would come together and look at this data on the team level, we would often share and talk about data from the Nike app, the sneakers app, and our user services, which were doing all the profiling and the identity work, our consumer data team, because they were contributing to the value stream. So we would look at it together, but the team definition would be as close to that product team definition as possible. Does that help?
It does, yeah. And I'm just kind of thinking about our implementation of this. And when you look at things like cycle time, flow efficiency, we've applied that, I think, very well in that construct, because it is in the construct of our Scrum teams, and in some cases at scale. When you get into things like NPS or EMPS, it's kind of a mixed mode implementation. Some of it's driven with a sort of an employee viewpoint, which might go through the org chart to do that. In some cases, there may be an opportunity or gap to kind of, how do you take those same results and reorient them and define the group as your value stream team, so you can kind of try to draw patterns from that as well. But even the way you can design something that like an MPS, the statements matter too. That's kind of an art experience, because you got to put the team member into the context of the environment or the team that person needs to be thinking about when taking the MPS. So if they take it with an org level, but then you try to group it in a matrixed way, you may lose some of the insight that you would glean otherwise. So just interesting to see it, because we see it all the way up to the top of the company, because we run our own voice of employee as well. But that's like a company-wide survey. So you can imagine the myriad of contexts that exists for something like that.
Yeah, same. And so usually that kind of company survey tends to be more org chart, right?
Right.
It's like, which is a great learning. With employee net promoter score, what I try to learn is, team definition to the best of your ability, and usually like even share that team construct in advance of asking the question, so the team knows they can like orient to like, I'm answering because I'm on the Zulily supply chain team. I work on warehouse management at Zulily. I'm answering based on that context. Then the second question might be, would you refer a friend or colleague to Zulily Tech? So I can learn both. Yeah.
Right. You basically put it in the same survey. Yeah. And they're basically reframing to the company level with the second question. Then you can get rich feedback from that too. That's good. Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing this.
You bet. Any other questions? Okay, maybe I'll keep going, because I notice we're close on time. These ones I'm going to fly through, but essentially I just have some visuals that have been leveraged in my past around. I talked about strategic prioritization for the lean folks in the audience. You may recognize this template. It's an A3X. You can download them, but we leverage this at Nordstrom to help with really understanding where our priorities, like what outcomes they were driving, how they align to our strategic intent, what teams were necessary in order to achieve the list of tactics. So that's the top of the visual. And then what we would do is we would, if you were a contributing team, if you didn't have the capacity to take on the initiative, then we didn't even bother to go ask the dependent teams or the supplying teams in this construct for estimates, because it was wasteful. Because if the primary team that needs to do work can't commit to the work, don't ask other teams to do work yet. And so that created a really good conversation, but also limited our amount of estimation happening in the teams, because estimation takes capacity. And if teams are doing estimation, then they're probably not writing code. And so we wanted to be mindful of how much WIP we had around estimation. So just sharing that template. And then this is another one. I talked about OKRs. This like snippet is directly from Felipe Castro's website, which I highly recommend if you aren't already following him. He's
excellent.
Isn't he great? Yeah.
I saw his talk at Agile 2017 in Orlando, which, gosh, feels like a lifetime ago, and I was blown away. Really knows this space well. His website's great. Tons of free resources there as well, for educational purposes. And I hear he does great workshops too. So definitely.
Yes.
Well, Felipe, you're not here, but we're doing a plug for you.
Yeah.
You'll see him on YouTube.
I'm pretty sure I saw that he did the Mix podcast.
He did.
So yeah. So I haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, but I'm guessing it's great.
That's cool.
So I would use this because often people needed a grounding mechanism. Like, what does it really mean? And what are OKRs? And then you can see a little bit down below. And this, honestly, and you can see it in the title bar, is like, we were just using Confluence at the time. Like, we just needed some place to make visible the OKRs that we were going to care about. And this goes to my comment about, we didn't jump to, let's go acquire a tool. We said, let's make sure that we can commit to the underlying practices that are critical to really achieve kind of the OKR structure. So that's one thing. The other one, so I'm also a big believer in leader standard work, and like, how do leaders really practice a lot of the same techniques that we ask from our teams. So I like to have leader work visible in Jira. That's the tool my team's using to manage their work. I like to track the cycle time of decisions and work that leaders are doing, because often we're a bottleneck. If the team's waiting on us to make a decision about something, it can impact their cycle time. And so I try to create a very similar mechanism for managing the work that the leadership team is doing. And then also having daily stand-ups with my leadership team. Let's look at our boards. What are we working on? What's in progress? Try to break it down to like, what are you doing today? So that we have it in a meaningful chunk, so you can really talk about like, are we making progress or not? And then probably similar to our teams, it feels really fun to hit the release button every once in a while and like clear out your Jira board. Like, I'm actually, shipping something. This is an example of the self-service dashboards that I was describing. So the very first one that's kind of behind is a capacity view. So this was, every team had captured what they're working on, and the color coding is showing where they're over or under capacity. So then we could go and look and say, wow, how are we going to balance out the work so that, and this happens a lot, funding milestones tend to be the arbitrary boundaries of like when work gets starts and stops. And so you would see these like waves of everybody wanted everything done in Q1. And then you'd have sometimes these lulls, and then everybody wants everything in Q4. And so it was a good way for us to visualize like where we might have the need to balance out the work. The middle one was our way of understanding team composition, because we really wanted to know, do we have the right amount of product managers versus developers versus quality versus Scrum versus program? Like, what is the team composition, and are we optimizing based on the work? So I've been in scenarios where there's arbitrary ratios. It's like everyone's going to be a 1-to-8. Well, but it should be informed by the capability and the work that's happening, because some teams might not need that ratio. It should be about the state of the capability. And then I talked about ENPS. So this was the kind of way that we were looking at our ENPS and the trending over time. So did anybody have questions on this? I like that, Katie. Yes. What are you using as your basis for capacity? Yeah, great question. Hours. So it's like, how many hours are we gonna use? I'm not gonna say that it's always been perfect, because you need to constantly iterate and understand. But really, it's the number of people in the team. How many hours do we have in the day? You got to accommodate for some amount of buffer, and then use that as your commitment, along with your, hopefully you're learning over time, the predictability of your cycle time as well, to know like what can we actually sign up for in conjunction with the team capacity that you have and the reality of that. Does that answer? Okay. All right. Oh, sustaining momentum. Relevant to the name of this meetup, this is a whole bunch of stuff from John's book. So you probably are going to recognize some of it. The first lead by example is directly out of Sooner, Safer, Happier. And I also definitely believe that leadership engagement needs to be in actions and not just words. Talking about what we're learning, creating that generative culture, being the ones who are willing to say that we don't know, and how are we learning along the way. I talked a little bit about empowerment. I believe in empowerment. I think empowerment requires context in order for there to really be true accountability. If you just say, yeah, everybody make decisions, I'm empowering the teams, but they don't have the context in which they're operating or the minimal guardrails around how to make decisions, then I think empowerment becomes chaos. Connecting the technology metrics to business objectives. Some of you may or may not have heard Chris O'Malley speak at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, but he co-presented with his CFO. He's the CEO of, it was CompuWare. He's like, if you show up in a business conversation and you start talking about your accelerate metrics, you're going to lose people. You've got to figure out how to connect the metrics to business outcomes. So I'm super passionate about that as well. And then you need to have these ongoing SMEs around ways of working, really part of the team, so that you're learning as you go and continuing to adjust and optimize the system. I also believe it's important to not be insular, bringing outside perspective in on some frequency just to get additional eyes on what you're doing and getting that advice. And then again, I took this bottom part right out of John's book, including the visual. And I think Knef, I think somebody chatted about it as well in the chat. So not a, or I should say a familiar concept for this group. These are leadership behaviors. And when I talk about leaders must evolve, these are the things that I believe in passionately. The first one, and some of you who know me have heard me say this, I'm a big believer that leaders need to honor and extract reality. And I added extract over time because I used to just have honor reality. But then I realized sometimes my teams wouldn't tell me reality because there wasn't psychological safety yet. And so as a leader, I need to create a psychologically safe environment so that I can extract reality. I'm also a big believer in Gemba. Leaders need to be close to the work. I added this comment in here because I got told I was being a micromanager because I wanted to go and see. And I said, it's go and see, not go and tell. Because I truly believe as a leader, when you get close to the work, you are there to be curious. You're there to ask questions. You're there to unblock if needed, provide support, not go micromanage the team. I talked about strategic prioritization, so I won't talk about that anymore. I'm trying to find, also, human error is not a root cause. There's a ton of industry conversation about that. So that's something that I could probably spend an hour talking about as well. And there's no single root cause. We work in complex systems. So there are contributing factors to anything that happens in a system, and we should be focusing on the contributing factors. And then I strive to be a lifelong learner as much as I can, just continuing to take things in and learn. And then I think my last slide is just what I have collected along the way as my inspiration. Not an exhaustive list, but just some of the things that I've used. So you'll see Felipe's site on there, and then some of the books that I referenced throughout the conversation. So that is all. And I guess we probably have a couple minutes if anybody has additional questions. Yes, Katie. Marcello, yes. Awesome. And there's so many great, I don't know, Dan, if we have a way to pull out, there's been resources pasted into the chat throughout the conversation. It'd be great to collect those and maybe even put them, I don't know, out in our, I don't know if we have a place to put that.
Yeah, I'll check with the group here and see if there's a way we can do that, but I'll make sure to paste this out when we wrap up the meeting. Absolutely. A lot of great contribution in the chat. Courtney, great session. This so practical, seeing all the specific examples and hearing sort of the comparison and differences between the large enterprise space and kind of the smaller organizational settings. Been great. What other questions do we have or feedback from our participants? We have a couple more minutes here before we wrap up.
Oh, I'm getting asked to share the slides. I can, yes, I will get those. Dan, should I get them to you? What's the best way to share the slides with the group?
We could probably just do it. We can do it in the Slack group and then post it out there.
Awesome.
For sure.
Okay.
Hey, Courtney. Matt
Hi, Matt.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you? It's good to see your face.
Yeah, you too. I wanted to, so I was going to ask a question about the speed that you talked about in the first slide, and then it kind of kept going as a theme. But I was kind of curious about your thoughts on, so there's a lot of different thoughts around like when to start and stop the clock, and then even within your peers. So deployment lead time from code commit to deployment. Mick talks about flow time, and then there's like customer lead time. I was just kind of curious, you know, from your experiences, what you're seeing as maybe more effective measures versus red herrings. And then also, I'm just curious, any insights? I'm sure that community is probably having a lot of fun debates within themselves. I was curious, just kind of your take on things.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I will tell you that I have encountered like every variation, I think. So I'm a believer in it should start from idea, like request, to customers consuming it. However you define customer. It could be internal customer, it could be external customer. And so that is, in my opinion, the ideal lead time measurement. However, there's a readiness component. So I have been in scenarios personally where I have said, and I got challenged on this by a lot of my industry peers, that I was sub-optimizing, and I don't disagree, but the organization wasn't ready to do what I just described. So I started with hit the backlog to deployed to production. So I did not include all the work that would happen to get the story or the work to the team's backlog. Now, the reason I did it was because at the time, the organization, like, there was nobody really interested in having a conversation about that front end part. They thought all the problems were in the technology side. And so I said, well, let's lead by example. Let's start tracking that duration, and we'll elevate like how we're thinking about it and the problems we're facing. And then over time, we will move to the left, for lack of a better term, and we'll get more input, and we'll look at the entire lead time. What I think matters most is being able to improve over time. So you can't be changing it on too much of a frequency. But if you can stabilize and agree on that definition and then learn and improve for some duration, that's what I think is the most important, to be able to understand current state, pick a target, and then learn. Because I've had teams say, I'll give an example from like the mobile space. I don't want to include submission to the Apple Store. That I have no control over that. But if you really ground it in the customer can't consume it until it's in the Apple Store. So we should care. Now, we may not use it as an area that the team can improve, but if we really want to know the true lead time of customer can take advantage of what we delivered, you'd incorporate the time it takes for Apple to approve it. So I don't know. I don't have like, I truly believe it depends on the context that you're in and the readiness.
I'm trying to figure out with, so it makes sense from a product delivery standpoint when we start to bring in like product discovery, and how do we even know if there's a product market fit here, or, you know, when do you start the clock there?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the speed to learning is so important, right? So one thing we added over time was a discovery like activity that was explicit, because we would get in the, spin mode where you're not really learning because you're not starting anything. You're just talking about it, or you're trying to understand it. And it's like, well, what would a prototype look like so we can get to learning as fast as possible? Yep. And then tracking how long that takes. Because again, it's a contributor to capacity drain, because often the same people are engaged in that activity as the ones that are doing things that you've already decided you want to ship, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
All
Great.
right.
Great questions and feedback and conversations. So I'll tell you what, I think that's a wrap. That's a good solid hour. And again, for everyone, thank you for joining our July edition of Sooner, Safer, Happier. We do this every month on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. So our next one will be next month in August. And Courtney, thanks again. It's a great session. Really appreciate you bringing all of your insight and experience as a leader for all of us to learn from tonight. It was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here.
Sounds good. Have a great evening, everyone.